Well, with all the experience you have between black bears, brown bears, and grizzlies, which one tastes the best?
Oh, well, I've actually only sampled black bear, so...
This is Bob Duchense's Wild Maine. Whenever there is a conflict between science, tradition, and ethics, the fur is gonna fly. Over the last month, we've dedicated quite a bit of airtime to the subject of this November's bear hunting referendum in an attempt to find out what the facts really are before we ignore them. The Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife opposes the bear referendum and argues that all of the science is on their side. To back it up, they point out that IFW has conducted the longest and best bear study in North America over the last 40 years. Proponents of the referendum say that the science is bogus or contradicted by studies far outside of Maine, and the state biologists are just being paid to lie. So I went out and got a couple of independent bear biologists. Let's test the claims and seek the facts, and let the chips fall where they may. Bob Duchense's Wild Maine is brought to you by Hammond Lumber, Old Town Trading Post, Dysarts, EBS, and Napa Auto Parts. My guests today are George Matula, an associate professor of wildlife biology at Unity College, and Deb Perkins, who got her advanced degree in biology from the University of Maine, owns her own consulting firm in Poland, Maine, and has studied bears in Alaska, New Mexico, Tennessee, and Maine. Full disclosure, both have done bear work for the Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife in the past, as most experts have, and in both cases, it was a long time ago. Also, full disclosure, I'll be asking some of the same basic questions to both, which are based on some of the claims being thrown around in the debate. Neither has spoken to the other, nor can they hear each other during these interviews. We'll see if their answers concur with each other on issues like, does baiting really habituate bears to people? Does it spread disease? Is baiting the reason the bear population has jumped 30% in the last decade? And a few other claims. We go first to George Matula. And you're an associate professor at Unity College.
That's correct.
Now, you have spent 30 years with IFW before that, though, so I'm sure some of the proponents of the referendum are going to say, hey, wait a minute, this guy is not unbiased. But a lot of that, your bear studies were actually in the very early years. We're talking 30 years ago.
Yeah, when I first came on as the bear biologist for the state, it was right after they had an emergency closing of the hunting season because they felt that we were over-harvesting the bears, and so it was not a very good relationship between, the department and the guides and other people and stuff. And so at that time, Roy Hughey had started the bear study in about 1975, I believe, and he had opened up a couple of areas. One was up in Spectacle Pond area, and the other one that was down in Stacyville, south of Patton. And he had those two study areas going, and then I was hired, and so at that time, which was 81, we decided to intensify our research efforts, and so we came up with using other tracking techniques and whatnot, and pretty dramatically increased the number of bears that we captured in radio collars. And then we also opened a study area down in the Bradford-LaGrange area, which was our third study area, and that was run for several years. I stayed with the bear study for, I think, around 3 years before I was moved up to the big game project leader. So that's kind of my background.
It's kind of funny to think that back then you had to close down a season because we were afraid there were too few bears. Now we're not meeting harvesting goals set by the department, and we seem to have an exploding bear population. So what happened?
Well, I think I'm not real as close to it as the department is, but my sense of what I've seen and whatnot was the fact that we haven't been able to harvest even enough bears under what we have right now for seasons and everything. Because I guess my understanding is the number of hunters has gone down. But the bears have done really well in Maine, and I think for quite a while we actually underestimated the populations, and for good reason, because we wanted to be conservative and didn't want to, over-harvest the bears. But they have done very well, and I understand that the latest estimates by the department is somewhere around the 30,000.
Well, proponents say that we've got this explosion of bears because we're artificially feeding them too much. Opponents say, no, it's really a change in the Maine woods with our change in clear-cutting practices and opening up the forest and making it a more young forest. We're making it very bear-friendly. Does your own experience and research point in one direction or the other?
Well, it's probably more observation and stuff. One thing that we do know that they are colonizing new areas in the state. The females are very slow at colonizing because they take portions of the mother's home range, and so they kind of inch out, whereas the males are much more adventuresome and more like a bunch of teenage boys on the prowl. So they tend to expand out much more quickly. The study area that we're doing in Unity College is in the Unity area, and it is an area that's just being recently colonized with females and producing bears and stuff. I'm not so sure that all the feeding has that big of an impact. I mean, if you went and divided the amount of bait that's been estimated, I don't know where those figures come from, but by 31,000 bears, that would give you like the poundage that they actually would get. But in reality, I mean, when we go out and try to collect bears for research and whatnot, we put out a lot of bait, and a lot of it isn't consumed by bears. There's other critters that also like it. Sometimes if the bears aren't interested in it, we have, video and stuff of bears coming in, looking at our bait and just kind of turning up their nose at it. And then another time they'll come in and maybe take it. So it isn't that sure thing of them actually coming in.
What are you actually studying in your study project at Unity College? What are you trying to learn?
Well, we're looking at this colonizing population and seeing how the data that we collect on the females, and look at how quickly they mature, how big their home ranges are, how well they produce and everything, compared to what the department is collecting. The department has 3 study areas, and they're pretty much in areas with fairly high bear populations or high densities, and ours are pretty low density. So we're in the early stage. We only have 2 years under our belt so far.
There is, of course, a balance of nature that we always talk about. Do you think we are in balance right now? Do we?
I mean, as far as the number of bears we have right now?
Yeah, just do you have a guess as to whether or not we have a sustainable environment for the bear population we currently have? I sense that, what they wanted before when they actually did the planning of trying to keep it down in, I think it was in the 20,000 bracket there, was kind of what the public working group wanted. Bears do prey on deer fawns, and they do prey on moose calves, but we don't know the total extent of that. In some states they've studied that, but so it's hard for me to say whether it's in balance right now. But I think the department's done a really good job of trying to keep their fingers on the pulse and knowing what's going on. Their study is pretty phenomenal when you think about it. It's been going since 1975. They are constantly working with live animals. They have animals that they know the family tree for years and years. They know who's been produced, who's died, and so they have really good, strong data, better than most states, on what the bear population is doing, what's affecting it, and the way they're doing it, they're also in a position to sense when something goes wrong much more quickly than some other ways of collecting data. My guest is George Matula, Associate Professor of Wildlife Biology at Unity College, which is conducting some of its own studies on bears in Maine. One claim that keeps coming up is that if we banned Maine's current methods of bear hunting, we'll just learn to hunt like they do out west. But out west, the trees are mostly Douglas fir and aspen, not a lot of nuts. Out there, hunters rely on chokecherries and autumn berries, which we don't have. So I'll put the question to George next as Bob Duchense's Wild Maine continues on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. This is Bob Duchense's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. This is our last show on bears. I've got a couple of independent bear biologists on today's program, and we're fact-checking some of the claims being made in advance of this November's bear referendum. One thing we've heard over and over is that when our bear hunting season arrives, we don't have the berry and cherry crop that they have out west, which lets their hunters identify a good spot to wait for a bear. In the east, it's beech nuts and acorns, and they're spread out all over, making it difficult for a hunter to find a spot to look for a bear. George Matula is Associate Professor of Wildlife Biology at Unity College. So, George, what's the truth? What are Maine bears eating during hunting season here?
Yeah, from a little bit of experience I've had, it would be pretty much your mass crops, like your oak and your hazelnut and the beech. Maine's woods, as you know, is very thick. It has a lot of undergrowth and whatnot. I worked on bears in Pennsylvania, much more open habitat because it's been so overbrowsed by deer.
Yeah.
I've only visited out west, and that's pretty wide open areas where I've seen, and so you have a much better chance of seeing bears at a distance. And here in Maine, you have to be almost on top of them, and even then, they're so secretive and so quiet when they move through the woods. So.
Yep, I had a conversation with one of the wildlife biologists for Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and this was Oregon, and we were talking about the fact that in eastern parts of the state, you can sight bears from miles away with a spotting scope, and sometimes see up to 10 per day, and be able to figure out which one you want to go after. And I just sort of laughed and tried to compare that to the state of Maine. Yeah,
and that's why it's so hard to compare. What's happened out in Colorado with what happens in Maine. One thing I did find out as a wildlife biologist in my career was that oftentimes you cannot, there's maybe research done in another state, and you can glean some information about it, but oftentimes it can't really be directly applied to the state you're working in because there are differences. Like I did research in Pennsylvania, then I came and did it in Maine, and there were things that were not the same, and so you have to be on top of the population that you're working with. So.
Well, the claim is also being made by proponents that we are getting bears accustomed to human food, and that is what's causing more of the problem bears we currently have. Any experience or substance to that?
Well, if you sit down and really think about it, if a bear comes into a bait, and what my experience and what I've heard too is that they're very, they don't come just charging in to feed or anything, but you think about it, the ones that do, they're the ones that get shot. So you're kind of selecting against bears that aren't wary and bears that aren't afraid of humans, So that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It's a lot different than feeding bears. In Pennsylvania, where I was doing research, they were feeding bears, the people there. It wasn't part of the hunt. And just so they could see bears, and they'd feed them by hand in the whole 9 yards. And that is what, acclimates a bear to humans, not being shot at, so.
Well, I guess the extension of that would be there's another claim being made by the proponent side that baiting increases reproduction rates, and yet, as you point out, if it's a bear who's unwary and goes to bait a lot, that's the one that's not going to reproduce ever again.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's I've never seen any data on that, that shows that that's actually what happens, So, and another thing I've noticed, just even doing the research and whatnot, is that you can put out good bait, and once there's good natural food, often the bears never show up at the bait, which can be frustrating. So.
Yeah. Well, something you put your finger on a few minutes ago. The department is worried that too many bears will spread starvation and disease. The Humane Society of the United States says that bait sites are actually the ones that spread disease. And as you said earlier, a lot of different critters will come into bait and feed. And is there any substance, do you think, to the idea that is spreading disease?
Not that we're aware of at all. I think the department would pick up on that pretty quickly if there was. I'd like to see some of their data that shows that. Because if there's some good solid data, that'd be fine. I'd like to see that. But again, it's the department is handling these bears year after year after year, and they pick up on. That's one of the nice things about what they're doing is that if there is a disease issue, it's going to show up very quickly.
Especially in those studies, because I know one of the things they really look for is mange, and that's the kind of thing that could be spread by coyotes or other carnivores coming into these bait sites. If they were spreading disease, mange, it seems to me, would show up much more in the bear population than it currently does.
Yes, I would agree.
Okay. Now, does the college actually trap bears for studies?
Yeah, we're actually trapping them. It's been two purposes. One is to collect information that be useful to the department and help them to understand what the populations may be doing in these colonizing areas and get them more depth to their management system. But also to give wildlife students at the college some real life experience working with research on large mammals.
Yeah, what kind of traps are you using? The cable snares or culvert traps, or both, or neither?
Yeah, we have two culvert traps, and we also use the cable restraints, foot snares.
Have you ever come across one of these bears that has been trapped that has injured itself, or even chewed a paw off, or anything like that?
No, we never had any chew their paw off. Once in a while, you get one. The ones we've had, you'll get one that might have an abrasion or something like that, but nothing. Nothing serious. We haven't so far.
Okay, well, one last final fun question. In hindsight, is there something you would have done differently 30 years ago when you first started studying bears?
No, I'm actually pretty pleased that it's kept going the way it has, and they've collected. To me, it's been a lot to say for the department that they have that kind of long-term commitment to a long-term field research on a major species. Very few states do that anymore, and but there's almost no substitute for that, because then you have a context when things go bad that you can detect it pretty quickly.
Well, great, and thank you very much for being on the program, George.
Yeah, you're welcome, and nice talking to you.
George Matula is Associate Professor of Wildlife Biology at Unity College. Another independent wildlife biologist is coming up. Some of the questions will be similar, and it'll be interesting to see if the answers are similar. In a moment, we'll welcome Deb Perkins to Bob Duchenne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. This is Bob Duchenne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. On November 4th, we'll decide if we want to change Maine's bear hunting laws. The Humane Society of the United States has brought another referendum to the state, 10 years after losing the last one. There are a lot of claims flying around, but there's one thing both sides agree on. The population of bears is exploding, up 30% in the last decade alone. Bear nuisance complaints are also rising. Proponents of the referendum say it's because we're artificially feeding bears. Opponents say that scientific research conducted in Maine demonstrates that's not the cause, and it has more to do with an increase in natural foods and bears colonizing closer to humans. Deb Perkins is an independent wildlife biologist who has studied bears in Alaska, New Mexico, Tennessee, and Maine. And she received her advanced degree from the University of Maine. She now runs her own business and does some work for the Biodiversity Research Institute, which conducts independent wildlife research in the state. So, welcome to the show, Deb.
Thank you so much, Bob. I appreciate you asking me to talk with you.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Actually, it's a necessity. I've been looking around for independent wildlife biologists who could speak on the bear issues that have come up during the referendum debate. And I was surprised to find there are a number of people who are qualified in the state to speak on the subject who are not currently affiliated with Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. Now, I believe at one time you were.
That's right. It's been almost 15 years now since I worked for the department. But yes, I was like a field technician for a number of years.
There's certainly going to be proponents of the referendum. They're going to say, well, she's still biased 16 years later.
Well, I guess you could flip that around a little bit, though, too, and say, well, she's actually seen how the department operates and seen their studies and seen what they do firsthand.
And furthermore, your resume has gotten a whole lot longer since you left the department. You have quite a history of being an independent wildlife biologist. You even run your own consultancy.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I do. I work with private landowners to help them improve wildlife habitat on their property. I write habitat plans for landowners that are interested in improving different aspects of their property that benefit wildlife.
Well, as I was looking around for qualified people who could actually speak knowledgeably on the science of this subject, I noticed that you have an advanced degree from the University of Maine with field work studying brown bears in Alaska, grizzlies in Yellowstone, black bears in New Mexico, Tennessee, and Maine. Wow.
Yeah. Yes. I was, for almost 10 years, I did bear research. I just fell in love with bears and their biology at a young age, at age 19, and I just kept working on bears until, about a decade later.
Well, with all the experience you have between black bears, brown bears, and grizzlies, which one tastes the best?
Oh, well, I've actually only sampled black bear, so I can't speak to the others. But
all right. Well, the bear population has been growing very rapidly, not just in the state but elsewhere. But let's just focus on the science of why is this happening in this state. There are claims being made on both sides of the aisle that really have not been fact-checked.
Yes. Well, as you know, Maine is a vast landscape, and it's mostly forested. We have a huge land base, and there's a lot of food that can be produced on that land base that bears benefit from spring to summer to fall foods. And on top of that, we have a decline in hunters. So bears, a lot of the farmland that used to be operating, a lot of the open lands in Maine have reverted to forests, so that's created more habitat for bears. And then we have this decline in hunting. So they're opportunistic. They've taken up new habitats, new places. They've dispersed into places in southern Maine that they never were, at least, in recent memory. So there's probably not a township or a town in Maine that there isn't at least a bear passing through.
From my own observation, and I get up in the Maine woods a lot, it seems like we've created much more bear-friendly habitat. And our forestry practices, of course, have created a lot of young trees, a lot of regenerating growth, which produces a lot of berries. It looks like we're now producing a whole lot more food in the last 10 to 20 years than we used to.
Yes, I think that's true. It's very complex, of course, and when you look at fall foods being the nut crops of acorns and beech nuts, it can get fairly complicated. I actually do a lot of work around that with my wildlife habitat planning to try to, if I've got a landowner that's got a nice stand of beech or a nice stand of red oaks, we might work on improving the growth and vigor of those trees so that they can produce more nuts.
I actually had a chance to speak to some of the wildlife biologists at in the state departments out west, and they point to the trees in Maine, the mast production, as you say, as a key factor of why their state is different than our state. And now you've done research in both the West and the East, so can you speak to that knowledgeably?
I don't want to step outside my expertise, but I would say that we can, on a good nut year, we can produce a lot of food, and that's why a lot of hunters on a good beech nut year or a good acorn year, they have trouble bringing bears into the state sites because the natural foods are so abundant. And that's what they're geared for. That's how they're programmed. They're going to go for the natural food. And that's why the baiting in particular, I mean, I'm a hunter. I don't bear hunt. One of the reasons is it's so time intensive and labor intensive. I mean, that's why, the proponents of this referendum have said, well, this food is going out there for 4 weeks, but there's a reason why. It's because you have to continue to provide that bait over the long term, and it has to be consistent, and it has to be abundant to really draw those bears away from those natural food sources and get them coming in consistently to a bait site. It takes tons of time, tons of effort, and that is exactly why. It's because bears are out there looking for those natural food sources in the fall.
And yet you hear the proponents of the referendum say that's a lazy way of hunting, and it doesn't quite jive with the idea that it takes lots of effort and time.
Yes, I know, and to me, that's really such a big piece of this, is we have the public who are going to be voting on something that there's a lot of misinformation, and there's a lot of sort of lack of first-hand experience or knowledge. I think once I start talking to my friends and family about this, they say, "Oh, Deb, you're a biologist. You worked with bears a long time. You know about this," and they're just so surprised when I tell them a lot of the information that I share with them about how difficult it is to hunt bears, still hunting. I mean, anyone who's spent any time in the Maine woods knows how thick it is, how difficult it is to see wildlife, especially bears. They smell you long before you see them. And that is why these methods are used, because this whole idea of fair chase, I mean, that's an ethics thing, and we can argue ethics till we're blue in the face. It's a very difficult thing to argue ethics because it's a very personal thing.
Mm-hmm.
But I just believe that people who don't have that personal experience, who haven't hunted bears or who don't even know a bear hunter or haven't been out, on the face of it, it seems completely unfair. I mean, I understand why people say, oh, you throw some donuts out in the woods and you shoot a bear. I mean, that just seems crazy. But once you start really looking into it and you understand how much effort these hunters are putting in, and not only that, but they have a very good chance of shooting a bear safely, getting a good kill shot, so it's very humane. They die very quickly. They can be very selective. You know, a lot of hunters, they pass up a sow with cubs because they see the sow with cubs coming in to the bait site, and they can see, oh, that's a sow with cubs.
That is one of the strange things about the ethical part of the debate. The one hand, there's the idea that it's just unsporting to shoot a bear over bait. On the other hand, there's the whole ethics of achieving a quick, humane kill of a bear that has been selected because of its size, maturity, the fact that it doesn't have cubs, which is much easier with the methods Maine is forced to use by its thick woods. That half of the debate never seems to be acknowledged.
Exactly, yes, I know. I think it's a cultural thing, very much so. That's why they talk about the two Maines and southern Maine, because we do have, people that move here, they love Maine, they move here, they love the wilds of Maine. Maybe they didn't come from a rural culture or a hunting culture, and I can understand that. When I was in high school, when I was a teenager, I was vehemently anti-hunting. I wrote a passionate essay against hunting. Now I'm a hunter. It's something about sort of putting yourself into that culture and understanding that these people are dedicated, these people are conservationists to the core. They protect this resource, they honor this resource. I mean, I have a deep reverence for bears, a deep respect for bears, and to me, I would much rather see these hunting methods continue and these bears being taken humanely by sportsmen who are following the laws, sportsmen and women who are following the laws, than to see bears become overpopulated. They're going to start taking risks into neighborhoods and places where there's food because they're going to be hungry. And to me, a starving bear, a bear that's going into a neighborhood, a bear that gets killed because it's a nuisance bear, there's no dignity in that. And that, to me, that is very cruel. And I know that is what is going to happen if we lose these methods.
Okay, that brings up one of the key points of disagreement. Is baiting bears responsible for overpopulation of bears? Deb Perkins is an independent bear biologist in Maine, and I'll put that question on the table when Bob Duchense's Wild Maine resumes on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. This is Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. I'm Bob Duchesne, host of Bob Duchense's Wild Maine, and Deb Perkins is my guest. She's a wildlife biologist who has studied bears all over North America. She now runs her own consultancy in Maine and is not in any way on the payroll of either side of the current bear hunting debate. Deb, one of the key claims made by the proponents of the referendum is that we're putting 7 million pounds of junk food into the woods, and that is why we have too many bears. Now, you're a bear biologist, so what's the truth?
If you're not a biologist, and even if you are, that at first you might think, oh yeah, that's crazy. That makes a lot of sense. But first of all, that figure of how much food we're putting in the woods is wildly inflated. It's based on one guide who was basically bragging about how much bait they put out, and it was extrapolated out. It's wildly exaggerated. Even with that wild exaggerated number, it works out to about 3 ounces of food per acre, and that's about a donut per acre. That would only be enough food to feed all of our bears for 4 days, all 30,000 bears for 4 days. If you know anything about the caloric requirements of bears in the fall, as you said, when they're hyperphagic and they're needing to gain so much mass before hibernation, they need a lot more than 4 days worth of food, and they need high protein foods. That's the key. That's what they get from the beech nuts and the acorns. When there's a good beech nut year and a good acorn year, we have a lot of cubs, and that's because they've had high protein in their diet. These donuts and pastries and things, these are just junk food, and as everyone has said, and that's part of the problem. And I can understand that. I can understand people not being thrilled with having junk food out in the woods, but when you think about the scale of Maine, it is so massive. These bait sites are really dispersed over the landscape, and a lot of the bears aren't even visiting them.
Here's another science question I've always wondered about. People will compare deer hunting with bear hunting, saying that, well, we can still hunt deer, but do deer have the same sense of smell or use that as much as bears do? It seems like bears have bigger advantages in avoiding humans. Yes,
they have much better sense of smell. If you look at an animal that's typically a prey species in the food web, they have large eyes, and their eyes are, kind of on either side of their head so that they can see behind them, like deer, for example. Bears, like us, have eyes facing forward toward the front. They're more of a predator, and their eyesight is not as good as a deer, but their sense of smell is extraordinary. I think polar bears can smell up to 10 miles. They can smell a seal hole from 10 miles away.
Wow!
And yeah, this is a cousin of our black bear.
I'm really going to think about this a lot the next time I fry bacon in the woods.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's the other piece, Bob, is people here, especially people that, have lived here their whole lives or have never lived in other places where there are bears there are nuisance problems. We are so fortunate in the state of Maine. You can go camping in the backcountry. You don't have to worry about your food, in general. You try to be fairly clean with it. But, you sleep where you cook, all that kind of stuff. If you go out west or go into some of these places where there's high populations of black bears, Yosemite or places like that, you have to be so careful. You've got to hang your food. You've got to make sure to sleep away from where you're cooking. It's dangerous,
I was out in Colorado, and this one shocked me. I was advised that if I'm camping in Colorado, after I am done cooking my dinner, I should change clothes so I'm not wearing something that actually smells like what I just ate.
Exactly, yes. When I worked in Alaska, I was studying brown bears in an area that has the highest density of brown bears in the world. And we had a viewing tower that we had built out of wood, and there was one point where I could count 65 brown bears at one time. That's
Really?
How many bears there were. There was not anywhere we could put our camp that was not on a bear trail. It was just a labyrinth of bear trails, this place. And it was exactly that. We actually had to put an electric fence around our camp. And we had bears hitting the fence regularly. In the night, you could kind of hear one hit the fence, and you could feel the ground shake as they ran off. Yeah, you cook, you splatter grease on your shirt, whatever. Bears can smell that. You sleep in your tent. I was just talking to a friend of mine who was at the 4-H. She was selling food through 4-H at the Oxford County Fair, and she said, "I'm so glad you talked to me about this bear thing. I had no idea about this, and you're totally right. If we don't continue these hunting methods, bears are going to their population is going to soar, and we're going to start." Because she said, "We've got a bear problem. We have a bear that keeps coming into our yard and gets into our bird seed." And she said, "I don't want any more of that. It's unsafe. It's hard on the bears."
Well, let's talk about that a little bit. There's, I think, the notion that if we just leave bears alone and don't bait, that the population is going to stabilize on its own and we don't need to manage it. That disease, starvation, the food chain, the food supply is going to limit the bears' forest, and we don't have to actually actively manage. What's the science behind that thinking?
That is a great point, because I think a lot of people believe that. And in a perfect world, that if there were no human beings in the state of Maine and we had never put down our human footprint, never colonized here, never moved here, never built farms here, roads, Sure, that would happen. No problem. That's what's called biological carrying capacity, is that the bears will grow to a point where the land sustains them and not beyond that point. That's Wildlife Bio 101. That's the first thing we learn when you take wildlife management classes, is about carrying capacity. So that's biological carrying capacity. Then there's sort of social carrying capacity. So what is the number of animals that humans are willing to accept? What is the number that works for us? And so, yes, Maine is heavily forested. It's still a very wild state. But yet, we have rural sprawl. We're all across the landscape. So it's not that Eden anymore. It's not that place that's just completely under natural influence. And that's why, in general, wildlife populations need to be managed.
Yeah, to some extent, what we're managing is us.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you that. Another claim being made regularly is that these baiting sites collect animals of various species in one place where disease is spread. You could probably say the same thing about making your backyard nature-friendly. If you're attracting a lot of different wildlife into one area, they're all spreading disease. How much validity is there to that claim?
Well, I don't think that's a very real concern. Maine Department of Fish and Wildlife has been studying these bears for 40 years. I mean, working beside Randy Cross, who is the bear biologist who's been in the trenches on the front lines doing this work. He knows all these bears. He knows their grandmother. He knows their great-grandmother. And, you know, he knows their stories. And when you have such close sort of monitoring of a population, you would know if these animals were getting diseased. I mean, animals that are part of the bear study, so animals that have been identified, have been marked and tracked. You know, some of those animals eventually get killed at a bait site. You know, Randy or any of the scientists at IF&W have not seen this disease that is being purported. I can see why people would think that and be concerned about it, and it's great to even consider it, but it's not at that level. I mean, these bait sites are not just these teeming places where there's just every animal anywhere nearby is coming to it. You know, it's not like that at all. You're going to have, most of the time, nothing happening there. Mm-hmm. The occasional animal coming through. Certainly with deer, feeding deer, I always tell people do not feed deer in the wintertime. Because they're a herd animal. You know, they come in large numbers. But bears are solitary animals. You know, they're not, and maybe people are talking about other critters. Like,
oh yeah, they're saying, you know, foxes, raccoons, skunks, bobcats, whatever. All of these animals are coming in and spreading, let's say, mange.
Yeah, no, I don't buy that. I really don't, because interactions between species, you know, they're pretty cautious of each other, a lot of these different animals, and they're not going to be kind of coexisting together at a bait site. I mean, it's a stretch. It's a real stretch.
My guest is Deb Perkins, an independent wildlife biologist who has studied bears across the continent. I've got one more question left, and it's a doozy. It's coming up as Bob Duchense's Wild Maine continues on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. You're listening to Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. This is Bob Duchense's Wild Maine. This is our last show on bears. Today, I've asked two independent bear biologists onto the show to get specific scientific opinions about the claims being made prior to the bear referendum in November. So far, even though they did not speak to each other before the show or hear each other's answers, they've been pretty consistently the same, supportive of studies conducted by the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife and opposed to the referendum. Now, you could say that's because many, many years ago, they worked in those studies. Well, true confession, I have twice asked the proponents for the name of any wildlife biologist in Maine who supports their side so that I could get their views on the air. No name was ever offered. So I'm wondering, Deb, are you aware of any Maine biologist who supports the yes side?
No, I am not aware. And, you know, when I got my first bear job when I was 19, one thing led to another because the scientist I worked for there knew another bear study, and then I got out to New Mexico, and then, you know, they recommended me to somebody else. It's kind of a tight community, bear scientists, and, you know, as has been said, you know, I've known Randy and Jennifer Vachon for almost 20 years, and they're very well respected, particularly in the East. So I know pretty much every bear biologist that would weigh in on this subject, and in Maine, there's really only, you know, I think you spoke with George Matula. There's people that used to work on the bear study. There's myself. There's really nobody that would support that, and that is because, you know, and people might say, oh well, you know, they're biased, but I have such a problem with that because it's not a bias. It's an expertise. You know, we are experts. This is based on many years of schooling and many, many years of field experience and actually living and breathing these critters and understanding them at such a deep level. It's not a bias. It's a knowledge. So, no, I don't know of anyone that would agree with that. And but wildlife management by public referendum makes me so nervous.
Well, it's just not fact-based. I mean, we're not... The whole reason I do this radio show and have done similar ones like it is to try to actually go get the facts.
Yes, and then there's just a lot of people that it's so emotional for them. They feel that they love bears and what an amazing animal. And see, that's the thing. It's this charismatic megafauna. It's this big, beautiful animal that sort of has this iconic place in people's minds. Right away, that plays on people's emotions because they feel like they need to protect that animal, and so, but they're not informed. They're actually misinformed. The proponents of the referendum are cherry-picking things. They're cherry-picking from so-called data, and it's getting misinterpreted, and it's being used to fuel those emotions. If I live in Biddeford Pool, if I live in Kennebunkport, and my kids are out on the school playground, and there's a bear out there, that's going to be a concern for me, you know. Mm-hmm. And it's not only a human safety concern, but that bear's been habituated, and it's attracted to humans. Oh, and that's the other thing, Bob, is that people keep saying, "Oh, this food that you're putting out there, that's habituating bears to human food." I disagree, totally disagree, because it's one thing if there's people out there and they're putting a donut on their hand,
right?
And they're trying to hand feed a bear.
Yeah.
These foods are being left, and that person who's doing the baiting, that hunter or the guide, they're leaving, and the only way they can get a bear to come in there is to leave, and the only way that they can get a bear shot is to put a hunter up in a tree stand, put scent blocker all over them, make sure they don't make any noise whatsoever. And then they might have a chance. And bears in Maine are fearful of humans, and that is why we have a low level of nuisance complaints. And you know, New Jersey. I remember going to an Eastern black bear workshop in New Jersey, a bunch of bear scientists all up and down the East Coast. And there are people there that are full-time staff at the state who do nothing but handle bear calls all day long. There's a bear in my yard. There's a bear in my house. There's a bear in my porch. In Pennsylvania, bears den under people's decks. Yeah, it's true. You can see it. It's and in some cases, you know, people are feeding bears right from their yards, and that's bringing bears in.
Isn't that just kind of the definition of stupid?
Yes, yes. And I would say leaving your bird feeders out, leaving your livestock food. You know, unsecured. That is going to habituate bears to humans.
Yeah. Not
a bait pile that's out in the middle of the woods, away from human buildings, and you know where people live and work and play. Well, that is just different.
Well, I think you put your finger on it a few minutes ago. A lot of this debate is because the bear is such a big, beautiful, charismatic animal. But when you come right down to it, a tuna is a big, charismatic fish, and I'm going to have it for lunch.
Yeah, well, that's very interesting, Bob, too, because I think the Humane Society has done really great work on domestic animal abuse, and I would really like to see them put a lot more of their money toward that sort of thing, toward looking at factory farming. I mean, some of the ways that our food is raised is just deplorable. I mean, these commercial feeding operations for chickens and pork and these feedlots and the way these animals are treated. I mean, I really make a concerted effort to only eat local food, local meat that I know the farmer, I know how it was raised, and I know the animal lived a good life. And bears is a good example. I mean, these hunters, this isn't a big trophy hunt. These animals are being consumed by the hunter. And if you think about it, this animal lived its whole life in the wilds of Maine, a beautiful free life, completely natural. And then their life is over in 30 seconds, and it's very humane. To me, if people are worried about cruelty and animal welfare, there's a lot of bigger fish to fry.
Well, frying those fish may be a different show at a different time. This show is over. My guests have been Deb Perkins, an independent wildlife biologist who has studied bears in Alaska, New Mexico, Tennessee, and Maine. Before Deb, George Petula was on the show. He's an associate professor of wildlife at Unity College. He studied bears in Maine and Pennsylvania. And Unity College is now studying how bears are moving into populated areas of Maine. Voters will make the decision November 4th. If you're interested in actual facts with regard to some of the claims being made by either side of the bear referendum debate, you can re-listen to the show or forward it to others. It's on the web at 929theticket.com. Most of us will probably make the decision based on emotion or personal sense of ethics or even personal experiences. I get into the North Woods a lot, mostly out the Golden Road or up the Telos Road to Chamberlain Lake. I'm amazed at how abundant the bear scat is on logging roads. This year I've seen bears just once, a sow with 3 yearling cubs, down a side road and gone in the blink of an eye. Bob Duchense's Wild Maine is brought to you by Hammond Lumber, Old Town Trading Post, Dysarts, EBS, and Napa Auto Parts. This is Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket.